Hello and welcome to the European Parliament in Brussels for this new edition of Talking Europe. Last weekend, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators took part in a global protest against politicians and banks. Inspired by Spain's Indignados and the Occupy Wall Street movement, demonstrators turned out from Europe to Asia to demand what they call global change. Now, this week, we've invited a member of the indignant movement. He will have the opportunity to confront a leading member of the European Parliament. Also, don't miss the second part of Talking Europe. As European leaders wrangle over how to solve the never-ending euro crisis, I'll talk to Guy Verhofstadt, former Prime Minister of Belgium and President of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in the European Parliament. Two guests here at the European Parliament. Starting to my right with Stephen Hughes. Welcome to our show. You're a British MEP from the Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. At home you belong to the Labour Party, which is now in the opposition, as we know. Also on this set, Damien, a French student who currently lives in the Netherlands. You're a member of the indignant movement. You travelled to Brussels last week to take part in this global protest movement. Now, this is, of course, an opportunity for you to confront a leading MEP here in the European Parliament and ask him all the questions you want to ask. And for you, Mr. Hughes, it will also be a chance to tell us what Europe is doing to address the fears of many young Europeans who are very worried about the fallout of the current crisis. But before we start our debate, I'd like to take a look at our report, which recaps what happened last weekend. As we'll see, it was indeed a global protest movement across the world in more than 82 countries.
The march against corporate greed is going global. 5 months after Los Indignados first took over the plazas of Madrid, the Occupy Wall Street movement is inspiring Europeans to vent their anger again. From Berlin to Brussels and Zurich to Rome. The Italian capital is on lockdown. Historical sites are closed amid tight security. Violent clashes break out as tens of thousands protest against the selfishness of bankers and politicians.
I hope this autumn will be our Arab Spring. That might be a little bit optimistic, but I believe dignity has no borders or flags.
In Athens, rallies decrying capitalism blend with months of anti-austerity demos. Civil servants again march on Parliament.
We're sending a message that the municipal workers will not back down. No matter how much the government tries to terrorise us, we will not back down until our demands are met.
Peaceful protests also sprang up in Australasia, including a Sydney sit-in, a march in Tokyo, and here, in Hong Kong's financial district. This latest wave of mass protests coincides with the G20 meeting of finance ministers in Paris. Their focus is trained on how to solve the Eurozone debt crisis, while across the world their indignant critics clamour to be heard.
A story by Rebecca Bowring. Now, Damien, we saw people in Athens, Rome, as far as Sydney. You were in Brussels last Saturday as a member of the indignant movement, the Indignados, as they're called in Spain. What was your main message?
Well, our main message was that we cannot take it anymore. We can't take the greed, we can't take the affront that's made to my generation, but not the only one, to all the generations that are struggling at the moment. And I think part of our message is that we are not understood. I think it's quite understandable that we can't be understood by politicians and bankers when we see their salary sheets. Most European citizens have to make do with less than €1,000 a month, and I don't think that's really well understood in this building.
I think I've got every sympathy with the movement. I've got relatives who took part in the demonstrations in London last weekend, and I fully understand the frustration. We have a sense of that frustration as well here on the left of the political spectrum in the Parliament. One of the major problems we've got is that the right dominate the Council, the Commission and the Parliament at the moment. We're only the second largest group. We feel we've got answers. We feel that we have the right pace of approach in terms of regulation of the financial sector, but we've been frustrated at every step of the way.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you here. Two things you mentioned. Financial regulation. The left of the European Parliament, or the left in general in Europe, has let Europe down, has let the citizen down on this. Should I remind you, it's your very own Gordon Brown that introduced light touch regulation,
Absolutely.
that liberalised the Bank of England. You know, the regulation of banks since the 1980s has gone out of the window, and the left of the political spectrum has a lot to do with it. The second thing I'd like to answer to is austerity measures and the reduction of state budgets. On this, of course, the left is slightly less aggressive than the Conservatives, wherever they might be. However, you have to recognise for example, half the budget, half the UK deficit in 4 years is still an enormous pace of cuts.
Absolutely, it's ridiculous.
And it's absolutely unnecessary because the reason that the deficit
it's far too
appeared...
fast and it's far too hard. I agree totally. On financial regulation, let me say, the left here, for example, has been calling for an end to the most dangerous forms of speculative trading. We've been frustrated in that. We've been blocked by the right, we've been blocked by the European Commission. Okay, we might have been to blame in some member states. I was no great friend of the Blair or Brown governments, let me say, and maybe deregulation went too quickly there. We've learned the lessons and we want to try to repair the damage, but we're being blocked. On austerity, download a document we've produced called A Fair Way Out of the Crisis, because it chimes with exactly what you're saying. We're saying, yes, we need to drive down debt and deficits, but if you run up a huge credit card bill, you don't try to pay it off in 6 months by starving the children. You've got to do it sensibly. I've got to say as well, we're winning some of the arguments. Barroso now is coming to the Parliament saying he agrees with the issuance of Eurobonds. He agrees with the introduction of a financial transactions tax. This is in our document, A Fair Way Out of the Crisis. A year ago, he was saying these things are impossible. So we're beginning to win the arguments.
I'd like to see European financial transactions tax introduced. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that the very people who said they'd introduce it, Sarkozy and Merkel, I don't think they'll let it happen. But that's a different issue.
Why did you think they will let it happen?
Because they have absolutely no interest in their politics. Their policy towards the financial sector has given a clear message since the crisis started that they are here to defend the interests of the financial sector. And I think in every single point of policy, since any suggestions that were put on the table about banking regulation have been put off the table by these two heads of governments. I'd just like to come back for a second on austerity measures. I think it's completely fallacious when you say we can't pay back the credit card right away. I think the left-leaning approach to deficit reduction is just as wrong as the right-leaning approach, no matter how much slower or smaller in scale it might be. The fact is that deficit reduction that has a social cost, a very real social cost for millions and millions of citizens, is not acceptable when the reason for these deficits is the greediness and the completely unwarranted headstrongness of the bankers.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, what we have been arguing here, we've had a crucial set of arguments in recent months around the new method of running macroeconomic policy in Europe. And there was a total fracture between the left and the right. We said, look, the architecture you're trying to put in place is going to freeze out any possibility of growth and employment, any sensible retention of public investment. And this is disaster. It means we'll wallow in the depths of a recession for the next decade with stagflation.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. I appreciate, and sorry if my words hurt a little, but this is the first opportunity that I have to say a politician face to face. I appreciate the wishy-washiness of the left in considering these things, but the fact is that deficits exist because tax revenues fell. They don't exist because we can't afford our social spending. And that is why any deficit reduction is not accepted by the citizens right now. And that's why we don't feel represented anymore by the left or by the right. I mean, I come from a traditionally more left-leaning background, and I felt completely betrayed by the left-leaning forces in the European Parliament or in Europe, in the world as general.
Then I think you need to spend a little longer. You need to spend a little longer working with us here to see exactly what we are trying to do. It's not wishy-washy at all. These are very specific proposals. Read the document, A Fair Way Out of the Crisis. These are specific proposals, a pact on growth and jobs, Eurobonds. Look at the revenue side of the picture. Look at the revenue side of the picture. Let's really tackle tax havens. The G20 need to get that on their agenda. We will not get out of the recession without growth and employment.
And we will never get an international agreement, whether on tax havens, whether on tax evasion, unless we agree to do it unilaterally at some point.
Let's go back to the financial transaction tax. You says that's not going to happen. happen. There is now a Commission proposal on the table, and I bet you Merkel will change her tune, Sarkozy will change his tune, because your movement is making the point that this is entirely popular. People are saying, let the financial sector take their share of the burden. Why should we, the ordinary people, be paying the full price of this? And that's why they will shift their position. The Council will shift its position.
Now, let me ask you a word about the structure of your movement. We saw hundreds of thousands of people around the world, but one thing is striking is that so far you've refused to have a clear leadership. I think it's a personal choice, but don't you fear that without a clear leadership, you won't be able to translate all this energy into political energy?
I fundamentally disagree. I think the absence of leadership is the strength of the movement. It's what's its driving force, if you like. In fact, I mean, I've heard someone say that the movement is not about ideology; it's about methodology. And in fact, the methodology that was introduced in the Queen's M in Spain, the popular assemblies that have been copycatted all over the world, this horizontal structure is the defining feature of the movement. And so we will never abandon it. When you say you have so far refused to have a leadership, I think you don't realize we'll never abandon it. The movement will always be horizontal, because as soon as it stops being horizontal, it will stop being the movement.
And you think it can make a difference? Because when you look at Spain, for instance, we saw these massive demonstrations in May, and yet the government hasn't backtracked on.
I think that there is a general level of acceptance within the movement that we have nothing to await and expect anymore from our political representatives. We have to. We want to change society, and I think we will be successful in this. We can already start to see the success that we're having, and that's despite the lack of any political leadership. But clearly we will only achieve success outside of the current political system, and we've accepted that, and that's why we have very difficult contact with the political world.
Well, it's the political world that are going to deliver whatever is delivered in the months and years ahead, and we need to work together to achieve that. To say that the political class is a total write-off is, quite frankly, not the way to go. You have not got control of any of the levers in society at the moment. What you need to do is to maintain the pressure on the people who have got access to the levers and make sure they do the right thing. And I think we are trying to do the right thing.
You see, Mr. Hughes, I disagree with people holding the lever. I think it's because some people, a few hundred people, hold the levers that our society is in such deep trouble. You know, if we were expectant from the politicians, we would only ever get disdain and no answer. And so when you say we have to work with the political world, I disagree. I think we have to abolish the political class.
What alternative do you see then? May I ask you?
What would you put in place?
Well, I think that our popular assemblies, every one of them at which I've been, are better decision-making bodies than any parliament.
And what have you changed as a result of that, directly yourselves?
Well, ourselves, we've changed our souls, we've changed our outlook on the world. How many times have I heard as I was growing up that our generation is politically apathetic and has absolutely no interest in current affairs? I think this is the absolute proof of it. We have no interest in participating in the existing political structure because it doesn't represent us and it doesn't represent our interests.
But if you stand completely separate and apart from the decision-making structure, you will not change anything materially in society.
No,
that's all I'm saying.
No, we disagree with the structure itself. I think if we participated, there was the suggestion in Spain that Democracia Ruralia form itself as a party. And this was blocked by the popular assemblies because we don't believe that by running into politics we will change anything. I think the only thing that will happen is that a leadership will emerge that will eventually get corrupt and we will just be one more corrupt party. So that's why we don't want to participate in the process.
Well, I've spent most of my life trying to make sure that the political process is changed to be more representative, to be more in contact with people. I'll continue to do that, and I'll continue to listen to your movement whether you like it or not, and try to do the right thing in the political life that I lead in this institution. And I hope at some point you'll recognise the need to establish some sort of dialogue to bring about the changes that both you and I want. Yeah?
I'm absolutely for the dialogue. Every time we receive an invitation from a politician, we have to decline it because politicians invite a delegation to their office, and that's not an invitation that we can accept. Because
they can't invite all of you.
No, well, in that case, they're very welcome to come to any popular assembly and speak as a normal citizen, or they're very welcome to organise a separate event where as many people can attend as possible.
But you recognise that the European Parliament, being the only directly elected body in the EU, has some legitimacy, and has to be into a dialogue.
It has some legitimacy. It also has a collective responsibility. When I hear you shifting the blame to the Council, to the Commission, to the Conservatives, I can't help but think that's exactly the sort of discourse that the citizens can't take anymore. It's because citizens are tired of hearing politicians tell us, oh, it's not my fault, it's the other guy's fault, that we don't get anywhere. There's a collective thought of the political world. The political class is unfit to rule today. And that is not your individual responsibility. So you are calling for a revolution, as far as I understand. Well, no, I think if we call for a revolution, we're going to get stuck up on the words. I think it can be an evolution. I don't think it necessarily needs to be a violent overthrow of the system.
Well, that's a relief to hear that. Yeah.
Clearly, there needs to be a fundamental structural change in the political and economic systems. And if you want to call that a revolution, then I'm not afraid of words.
But I mean, we are partly to blame that we lost the last election at the European Parliament. I'll admit that. But I'm merely stating the reality when I say that the Council, Commission, and Parliament are dominated by the right wing at the moment, and they're not listening to the points that are being made by your movement. That's all I'm saying.
Are left-wing governments doing any better? Is Mr. Zapatero doing any better?
Well, you've got to recognise the reality of the financial, the credit rating agencies breathing down his neck as well. Unless he does what Merkel and Sarkozy says and impose absolute rigorous austerity, he'll be downgraded to triple X.
That's kind of the problem, isn't it,
Stephen? He'll be downgraded to triple X, and interest rates will go through the roof.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there as we're running out of time, but thank you very much for this very lively debate, and thank you for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe. Now, please stay with us.